All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event honoring the 5-year anniversary of the U.S. Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking and its final report to Congress and the President. My name is Nick Hart. I'm president of the Data Foundation. We're a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit that champions the use of data to improve society. And really talking about the Commission's recommendations, it's a natural part of the work that we do. We're thrilled to do it because, as many of you know, this is something that we have been proud to champion and carry the torch for many years. And our partner today, the Bipartisan Policy Center, is an organization that has also really been a great partner and a champion of the Commission's for many years as well. In just a few minutes, I'll invite Bill Hoagland, a good friend, to offer remarks as well. But while we're hosting the event today in partnership with BPC, the story is not about us. It's about the hard work of the Commission members and the staff who have really toiled for years and many years ago to offer a vision, a set of unanimous recommendations, and a framework that suggested a new way of thinking to address many of the real challenges for our country and how we use data. The Commission concluded that in our country, we need evidence to not just have a seat at the table for decision making, but that the use of data should really be routine for informing decision making. They offered 22 recommendations that encouraged access to data, stronger privacy protections, and enhanced capacity for evidence-based policymaking. We have many of the commissioners and staff here in the room, either in person or actually in our virtual room. And I just want to briefly recognize those that are here. During our program, you'll hear from several of them: Catherine Abraham, who was the chair; Shelley Martinez, the executive director; Kim Wallen, another one of the commissioners. We have Robert Che, a commissioner. I'm gonna hope I get everybody. Sharon Boyven, one of the staff members. I heard Lucas Hitt is down on the sidewalk on his way up. I'm gonna struggle now. There are others here in the room. I know online we have many also joining us. It's safe to say that each had significant contributions to where we are today and in the years since, with the substantial work that led to the passage of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, the National Secure Data Service Act that recently passed as part of the Chips and Science Act just a few weeks ago, the Federal Data Strategy, and much, much more. Today, the Data Foundation is actually releasing a progress report that summarizes much of this progress. And I want to say thanks to one of our research fellows, another one of the former Commission staff that's joining us online, Sarah Stefanik, for her contributions. And I'll say much more about that as we close out today's program. As part of the progression in implementing the Evidence Commission's recommendations, it's important to recognize the Commission did actually end officially as a governmental entity back in 2017. And much of that torch was then carried by those on the outside of government and some who continued their roles as staff members inside government agencies. So you're going to hear later today in our program from some of the partners who worked in nonprofits outside of government. And as one of those key leaders at the Bipartisan Policy Center, I want to briefly invite to the stage Bill Hoagland, who's the Senior Vice President at BPC, to offer a few words. Bill.
Thank you, Nick. BPC is honored to be a partner with Data Foundation on this, the 5-year anniversary of the landmark Commission report. I keep the report with me. I look at it every once in a while. It's really well done. We were proud to play a very small role in promoting the Commission's work and later in implementing the legislation that carried out its recommendations. Bipartisanship is very appropriate when we remember that the Commission itself was the result of an initiative led by then Republican Chairman of the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan, and Democratic Chairwoman Patty Murray of the Senate Budget Committee. That odd couple first discussed the idea of establishing the commission back in 2013 while they were negotiating on another piece of bipartisan budget legislation. But once he became Speaker, Ryan, in 2014, he and Senator Murray redoubled their efforts, as I recall, to enact legislation establishing the commission, which they successfully did. And President Obama signed the legislation establishing the commission on March 30th. As an old Senate staffer myself, I'm compelled to give a shout out to a couple of congressional staff that were instrumental in the legislation. Ted McCann back here, who was with Speaker Ryan, and in the office of Senator Murray, John Ryder. Somewhat amazing, the commission was able to hold its first meeting just 4 months after the law's enactment, under the leadership of highly respected co-chairs Catherine Abrams and Ron Haskins, and the outstanding staff that led by Shelley. I should note that they accomplished something unique as it relates to congressional mandated commissions. They completed their work on time and under budget, as I recall. As an old budgeteer, I respect that. That staff Shelley was able to put together so quickly included details from the administration, including, among others, Lucas Hitt, who has joined us yet, not yet, I'm sure, and Dick Hart from OMB. Nick, as you all recall, was the policy research director of the commission, and once the final report was released, a colleague of mine at BPC, Sandy Davis, and I approached Nick to come to BPC and not return to OMB. And OMB's loss was our gain. Nick accepted our offer, and shortly after the commission released its report in September, we launched the Evidence-Based Policy Initiative under the direction of Nick at BPC. Our goal was then, along with others, to advance and help implement those recommendations and bring about the availability of more information, rigorous implementation. The legislation, the other legislation was introduced right after that by Speaker Ryan now in October of 2017, was a legislation to carry out the report's recommendations. And I don't think I'm understating it at all when I say that the foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018, the Evidence Act, was in large part due to Nick's persistency and hard work to see it come to fruition. Let me note again that the legislation passed in the House with overwhelming bipartisan support, 356 to 17, so you know, C, and by unanimous consent in the United States Senate. Nick shortly after that came here to the left as came over here to the Data Foundation. So I look forward to the discussion today with Catherine and Shelley and Nick on the impact of the Commission's recommendations and the Evidence Act and what impact it has had as the passage of the Evidence Act resulted in as in Speaker Ryan's words, a sea change in how we solve problems. I look forward to the discussion. I am particularly interested in how the agencies are doing in establishing chief data officers, evaluation officers, and statistical officers to coordinate the policy issues. In one sense, I think we've made a lot of progress over the last 5 years, but in another sense, we have a long way to go and maybe even have had some setbacks. I hate to be a downer here, but let me explain what I mean. Remember, the Commission and the Evidence Act and what followed was all bipartisan. Evidence and facts place no fealty to any political party or group. However, I have some concerns. In 1970, when I kind of got on this merry-go-round many years ago at the CBO, the General Social Survey conducted by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago asked Americans how much confidence they had in the scientific community and the social sciences community. Political affiliation did not vary. Republicans and Democrats both had good confidence in science and its impact on public policy decision-making. Fast forward to today. That same survey finds only 48% of Americans have a great deal of confidence in the scientific community, but there now is a 30-point gap in confidence between Democrats and Republicans. In 2021, 64% of Democrats had a lot of confidence, whereas only 34% of Republicans said the same. Unfortunately, the politicization of evidence, data, and science has found its way into the policymaking process. Why has this occurred? I will leave it to you and others who are attuned to this to answer the question, but some point to the problem occurring in the issue of a broad replication of social science data analysis, the problem of irreproducible results worsened by researchers' own bias. It's always wise to remind the research community and those of us laboring in these vineyards that we must always abide by that simple principle that evidence must guide the beliefs we hold rather than conform to them. Others point to maybe agenda-pushing ideologies that fall in trust in some of the positions of authority. I'm referring here to the recent decision of the National Academy of Science to bar Jane Lupacento, Deputy Director for Climate and Environment at the White House Office of Science and Technology, barred her from participation in publication activities for the next 5 years. It only takes a couple of errors of judgment, and yes, Dr. Lupacento admits to undermine the question of integrity and honesty at the highest government level. And without truth, quite frankly, democracy is hollow. Clearly, these are very challenging times. My final comment, a little bit more positive. I was struck then, as I am today, of a reference in the Commission's report that cited James Madison's remarks on the founding of the country, one of the founding countries that established the Constitution. It was Madison who, with his impassioned arguments, thought that future legislators should, and I quote, rest their arguments on facts instead of assertions and conjectures. Every generation since, every person in a position of authority making policy decisions today must reflect on Mr. Madison's admonishments and always seek evidence and facts. It's not easy, I understand firsthand, but the Commission's recommendations, thank you very much, and the Evidence Act continue to uphold that critical standard.
Just a few logistics notes before we turn to our discussion with the Evidence Commission's leadership. First, this event is being live streamed and recorded. So if you are joining us, feel free to join on social media using the hashtag #DataLive. For those joining in person, just a reminder for those that have not been to in-person events in a very long time, please mute yourself, folks. The restrooms are located to your left, just outside in the atrium. And if you'd like to have conversations during the event, please take those conversations outside. Just after the event, for those in person, we will have a reception on our outdoor terrace. For the hundreds joining virtually, welcome. We will invite your questions at any time, and you can place those in the platform. For those that are here in person, we will also ask your questions and we'll invite those as we go through the program. With that, let's start our discussion. And I'll invite Shelley and Catherine to join me on stage and we will dive right in. So, Catherine and Shelley probably need no introduction to this crowd, but I will do it nonetheless. Catherine was the chair of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, a former commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, former member of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House. And I'll just add, in the years following the commission's work after her appointment, she also contributed extensively to the work of the commission, including advising on implementation and navigating with the conversations in the Hill as the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act was being negotiated. And that was probably a role that she didn't actually know she had completely committed to. Shelley Martinez was the executive director invited by Catherine to lead the staff and coordinate with the commissioners. And that is an incredibly important role for those that have never seen the ins and outs of a commission. They coordinate everything, including the negotiations behind the scenes with the commissioners, Shelley since has gone back to her role at the Office of Management and Budget as a senior staffer, senior statistician in Hawaii at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, where she has helped lead the development of the federal data strategy and as a key leader in the federal statistical system. So Shelley, Catherine, thank you for your leadership in the commission, but also in the years since for all of the follow-up work. I really want to dive in and just note a lot has changed since the Evidence Commission put out its report. 5 years ago, a lot has changed in the world, but also as we've kind of evolved in both the legislative and administrative context of the implementation phases. And I get asked this question a lot, so I'm going to throw this to you about how relevant the Commission's recommendations are today as the world has changed so much. Catherine, I'd like to start with you.
Thank you, Nick. And I will say, in terms of the follow-up to the Commission's report, Nick's a very hard person to say no to. To answer your question, I think the Commission's report and recommendations are very relevant today. I do want to acknowledge that the Commission grew out of what was already a growing interest in improving the evidence base for policy. So we were, to some extent, on this trajectory anyway. But I think the Commission's report laid out a framework for moving forward that has proven to be really helpful. The passage of the Foundations Act, again, put up some important things into law. Often when I talk to people in the federal government, they will say things about, well, we're working on implementing the things we need to do as part of the Evidence Act, and I just love to hear that. So I think it's making a big, I really think it is making a difference.
Thank you. I agree. It's always good when I can agree with Catherine, which I do most of the time. I would agree that the Evidence Act itself and all the work to implement it has really made it sort of inevitable that the Commission findings and vision and sort of big picture approach has just been a touchstone repeatedly. And I would say those of us in the federal evidence community go back to that as sort of a starting point often as we're thinking about what implementation might look like in a particular context. And I thought I'd just give a couple examples from kind of inside the federal government. One, I think if you reflect on some of the policies and guidance that have come out from the White House in the last year or so, the concept of evidence-based policymaking is really in many of those memos. It's a foregone conclusion that that's a starting point, whether it's the equity policies, whether it's climate, whether it's how we get back to a place of scientific integrity that agencies are being best practice in that regard, and all those sorts of things. So, as I look across the span of policies that have come out, the Commission worked a lot on kind of the supply side, but also on the demand side. How do we make sure that there's demand for good evidence? And I think seeing it in these policies is really a good example of policy officials creating demand. And then on the other side, the supply side, I think about how we are trying to implement the part of the Evidence Act that's about functions that the Commission thought the National Secure Data Service would carry out, but without the existence of the National Secure Data Service, we've had to figure out how to do that within the statistical system. And so it's a very different implementation or application than we might have envisioned, but the Commission report provides that touchstone, going back and thinking about, well, what were the functions about? Why were those important functions? How would those functions look in a different context? So we still are having some very future-oriented conversations, but the Commission report does the vision and recommendations and frameworks are still a useful foundation for us.
And Shelley, it's interesting to hear you say that the pieces of the puzzle that were maybe started before the data service was actually implemented. Of course, the data service does not yet exist, but there's been a lot of progress that was already started by the federal statistical system. And that's a nice segue to the next question for you, which is what are our greatest achievements so far? Because there's been so much work that was already started in the ecosystem. And of course, that's not to say that even before the Evidence Act or before the Commission, there was not a strong foundation to start from. But really looking back since the Commission's report, since the Evidence Act, what do you think are the kind of greatest milestones, greatest achievements in the last 5 years?
Nick likes to ask easy questions. I think back to this idea of, Nick has pointed out that the commission kind of came up with this concept of an ecosystem, and Nick's background is environmental, so maybe that came naturally to him. But I think being able to think about the statistical system as a core, a traditional, longstanding actor, but that there are many other actors that are really relevant. We have really begun to, I think, it's become ingrained much more so that this is kind of an activity that is a broad ecosystem with many interdependent actors inside the federal government and beyond the federal government. So I think, the commissioners I know worried a lot about how you avoid sort of compliance. We wanted this to be about culture change within the government and so forth. And I think this idea of an ecosystem with interdependent actors has really been, has taken hold. It's taken hold even in the way OMB thought about its first guidance. Issued under the Evidence Act, we were able to conceptualize this idea of a team sport among the key actors that were created by the Evidence Act, but also those that already existed and also played important supporting and complementary roles. And then realizing that it was going to be hard to sort all of this out, it actually was really helpful to think about operating as a team. And we see that in the OMB guidance to agencies to not only appoint these officials, but to put them on a data governance board within their agencies where they are talking to each other all the time about how to participate as a team to move things forward. It's very difficult as an individual actor to move things forward in a big federal department, but as part of a team, much easier, even though it's still hard. And we see a growing commitment across the executive councils, the Chief Data Officer Council, Privacy Council, the Statistical Council. These council leaders are meeting regularly and growing in their ability to collaborate across agencies, across domains, across professional occupations and perspectives. And lastly, as we think about the advisory committee that Nick is a member of, that's really, I think, enriching our understanding of this ecosystem, significant components in state and local government and all other aspects of society. So I think we're really getting some of the cultural taking hold that the commission had hoped for and thinking broadly about this.
So that advisory committee, by the way, for those who may not be tracking, the Federal Advisory Committee on Data for Evidence Building was actually among the commission's recommendations that was intended to be about the National Secure Data Service. And the Evidence Act sort of extrapolated that a bit as a signal from Congress to say, we're interested in the data service, but we're not quite ready to go there. And so it created it, the committee's been active and is about to issue its 2-year report just around the corner next month. So now the data service, of course, is authorized in law. So nice synergy of maybe another milestone coming down the pike. Right. Well, Catherine, I'm going to bring you back into this conversation because there are naturally a lot of challenges and barriers that remain. And while a lot of progress has been made, and Shelley's noting a lot of achievements and milestones, there's also a lot of commission recommendations. Not to exaggerate, there are some commission recommendations where not a lot of activity has happened. What do you think are maybe some of the areas where there are still a lot of barriers or maybe challenges to be addressed?
I guess I see 4 things I would mention that I see as challenges. One of them is the legal environment. It was something that the commission talked about. What we said was, and what the foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act says, is that where there are no legal barriers to accessing sharing data, the presumption should be that it will be shared for evidence building purposes. But a lot of the data, so some very important data, at least for building evidence about policy, is data for which there are legal restrictions on access. And I'm thinking especially of the IRS, the tax data. Other countries have been able to figure out ways to give people access to that sort of data for research projects that are going to lead to valuable evidence conducted in a secure manner. But legally, we mostly can't do that. So I think that's an important barrier to getting to where we want to be. Picking up on something that Shelley said, actually, I think another issue is the fact that we're operating in a federal state environment. And a lot of the data that are relevant for policy are data that the states collect in the process of implementing federally funded or partially federally funded programs that don't necessarily make their way back up to the agency that's involved. So I think that's an issue that we don't actually have at the federal level, all of the data that would be important to be able to look at. And there's the flip side of that, which is if we're asking these states to collect data and curate the data and send them up to the federal government, we also need to be making sure that they have access to the data they need for making their decisions. So I think that's something we haven't really quite figured out yet. I will mention culture. I think the culture of the federal agencies is changing, but I think that's a slow process. I think in the past, the presumption always was that if someone wanted access to your data, there were risks there, the benefits were uncertain, and maybe you wouldn't share it. And I think hopefully that's changing, but I think it's probably not quite there yet. And then I have to mention resources. Making full use of the federal government's data resources is going to require financial resources. I know that some agencies have been able to make the case that they need some funding to do the things they're being asked to do, but that's not the case for all of them. And I don't think we're really going to succeed unless we address that.
Those are excellent points. Obviously, the capacity comes with resources, and we have to be very honest about that. The commission did have a recommendation, as we were talking about just before the program started, about resources, and definitely one that Congress appropriators should be very mindful of in the years ahead. And I can say that because I don't work in government, but hopefully one that agencies and OMB and others will also be mindful of in the years ahead. And we'll probably hear this theme over and over as we continue our program. But I won't ask Shelley to comment on it. But I will ask Shelley to comment on, I mean, obviously OMB really is at the center of a lot of the implementation of this work. The federal data strategy was coordinated in large part through OMB, and you have the benefit of having this government-wide perspective, as you've already been alluding to. I guess it would be important maybe for those that are tuned in today or here in the audience to hear from you how important that is. Well, okay, hey, let me ask this as a question rather than a commentary. How important is that in this work going forward and over the last 5 years for the actual implementation? Has it been I'll stop there. Just take that as the question, Shelley.
That the retrospective part of that might get me into less trouble than the future part. So, no, I think it's, I obviously come from OMB, so I have a bias about its role, but I think, OMB does offer a really interesting perch kind of in the center of government, as do other parts of the White House. And, when Nick and we were preparing for this, this event, Nick had wanted to ask about kind of how that perspective influenced the commission. And I would say it is very helpful to think about having folks from a variety of different vantage points, thinking about the federal government as a whole, OMB in particular, but the federal government as a whole. So I think among the commissioners and the staff, we had people who had worked at OMB, who had worked in other parts of the White House, like Catherine, but with OMB, and those who worked in other parts of the federal government, and also those who worked with the government from outside. And all of those are really valid perspectives. And I think that helped us to have sort of a reality check on much of our work, coming from all the different perspectives. And I think OMB's role now, I mean, my particular office is the coordinator and leader of the federal statistical system, and I think OMB at large does play that role. I think, I mentioned our executive councils are just a variety of ways that we try to encourage and enable interagency collaboration and that broad perspective. And that I think is essential to how we implement all of the Evidence Act and move the evidence agenda forward. I was struck during the work with the commission about just the diversity of capacity across the federal government agencies. And I think we still see that. Catherine's point about resources is part of that. But even in 2017, before anybody was asking for funding for these things, we saw a real difference in capacity So we have to acknowledge that that does still exist. And so in that world, it's really important to have the executive councils, other agencies available to kind of help those who are struggling more, to be kind of the guiding lights, and agencies are going to be good at some things more than others. And so that ability to kind of look across and pull all that together is still really essential to how we're going to get this work done.
All right, so let's talk about your favorite accomplishments at this point, because I think you two are both uniquely positioned to opine on this question. There has been a lot that has happened. There are obviously a lot of agencies taking actions. There's a lot of heterogeneity in how agencies may be implementing. But just as you reflect back on the really good things that have happened, what would you say is kind of the thing to be the most proud of in terms of the accomplishments of coming out of the commission's work? Catherine, can we start with you?
Sure, I should preface my comments by saying I'm a lot less day-to-day with this than Shelley is. So my perspective is more from a bit outside at this point. But I guess the things that seem to me to be the biggest accomplishments are putting in place chief data officers, putting in place chief evaluation officers, and having the agencies really beginning to in a very serious way, take stock of their data resources, figure out how to curate their data resources, and develop learning agendas for figuring out the questions that they need to have answers to, and figuring out what research is going to give them answers to those questions. I just think that's all very exciting. So I guess that's what I don't want to say I'm most proud of it, because I don't think it's the work of all the people in these agencies that's accomplishing this, but it makes me really happy.
Thanks, Catherine. I agree. That's been really essential. When the Evidence Act passed, we talked about how there are people who now it's their job to get up every morning and think about this stuff. And I think we realized that it would take that kind of person and plan to make progress. And I agree that our three Evidence Act officials and their colleagues have been a big part of the progress that we've made. I think when I think big picture, I would say a really great accomplishment is the fact that this conversation is alive and well 5 years after the commission report. I think we are seeing it take hold, and yes, it's taking time, probably more time than any of us would like, to get some things accomplished. But I think the fact that it is in all the conversations I sit in with those Evidence Act officials and others, you just don't really have a sense that this is about compliance. You don't have a sense that this is something that they have to do. This is something that's important to them. And we have this generation of professionals, sort of a first generation of who are learning to do this together as a team, who are learning to do this with support from R&D and the broader community of foundations and others outside of government, civic society, and civil society. And I think that's going to be our new normal. And I'm often struck by how we are setting precedent day to day in the decisions that we make about who to involve in decisions, who to invite to the table, and all those sorts of things. And so my hope is that after we're all retired and the next generation is here, they'll think that's just normal. That's how we do government. So I think the fact that this conversation has really taken hold, to me, is probably the greatest accomplishment. And yeah, lots more to come on the specific milestones. But I think we've made a lot of progress.
I might add one observation based on something Shelley said earlier, which was the use of the term ecosystem. And Shelley, you gave a shout out to my background as in environmental science. And I have a distinct memory of a commissioner objecting to the term ecosystem in the editing of the report. I do not remember who it was, but I think if you were to probably Control F the report, you would not find the term ecosystem. But the fact that the concept has gained hold and that the community is much bigger than it probably once was, I think is also something that is really important. So Catherine, you mentioned the people, the evaluation officers, the statistical officials, the chief data officers. And it really is a testament to the fact that this is a big community. And this is not about the traditional disciplinary silos that we historically found ourselves in, and particularly in government, where we can so often find our bureaucratic silos. and increasingly finding these ways to work across those silos and talking about data sharing and improving access to information. I think it's so important to recognize that this is like an ecosystem. So Shelley, you brought that concept into this conversation very quickly, and you both sort of just acknowledged how important these themes are as we reflect back. So really, really incredible to think about how much progress has been made in that spirit. Well, the commission probably didn't accomplish everything that you might have envisioned or that people wanted it to. And if you think back to the charge that it was given by Congress, it was quite expansive as it was being stood up. And I know there were hopes and dreams of probably different actors and members that were coming in. And obviously there was a lot of public feedback through the process. But as you're looking back now, a little bit removed, I'm curious if there are things in hindsight, as we're talking about the accomplishments and having a little bit of this retrospect. Are there things that you maybe wish the commission had opined on that it didn't? Catherine, can you start?
Well, I wish we had said, basically, no. I think that the report covered pretty much what I would have hoped that it covered. Bill alluded to how quickly the commission got going, and that's true. We had our first meeting 4 months after the legislation establishing the commission was passed. But that only gave us just over a year to do all of this work, assembling the staff as Shelley did and so on. So from the beginning, I think our goal was to establish a framework, not to create a blueprint. And I think we accomplished that. There are some places where if I had been writing the report myself, I might have said slightly different things. But we also felt that it was really important to agree on a set of recommendations that everyone on the commission could endorse. And we did accomplish that. I guess I won't go into the places where I would have wanted to push harder, but overall, I was very happy with, thanks to the other commissioners, the staff, with how this came out.
Yeah, I agree. And I was thinking about the issue of was there more to be said on certain topics? And I think there was a lot of wisdom. I'm looking at Robert in particular right now, but a lot of wisdom and discernment about what is the right level of detail to offer. I think we've seen other examples outside the commission of being really prescriptive about things where maybe that's not as helpful. And so I think we had a lot of experienced hands who helped us think about, what does Congress want to hear and maybe not more from the commission, and what does the executive branch, what does OMB want to hear from the commission, maybe not go beyond that. So I applaud kind of the commissioner's judgment and wisdom in that. So, enough was said to make the points without trying to prescribe exactly how a particular agency or a particular legislator would approach something. So I look back and I really see that as a strength. And I say, having said that, not having the blueprint, not having all the details laid out has made it a lot more work on the other side. I don't think when I came back to OMB, I would have guessed that this was going to be as big and complex as it has turned out to be. But it's a real joy, of course, to be involved in the work. But it's a lot to do, particularly when we're trying to go beyond compliance. So it did leave a lot of important details to the rest of us to figure out, and we're on it.
So we didn't script the responses to any of these questions. So I wasn't quite sure how you were going to either of you were going to answer that one. But for those who are joining online, if you have questions for either Catherine or Shelley, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the few minutes that we have left. And the in-person audience will turn to you in just a moment. But one more question before we turn to the audience questions. The House Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress had a recommendation to have a congressional evidence commission. And I heard some snapping and just so this is a little bit of a rehash, a slightly different way of thinking about evidence in another commission. Curious if you have any advice for those who might be working on standing up this commission. Slightly different charge, slightly different task, but you've lived the experience. What would you say to those who are beginning this new task for Congress?
So I've been interested in what the Congress had in mind, and it's not entirely clear to me from what's been made public. I don't think it makes sense for the Congress to set up a commission that rehashes what the Evidence Commission did. And I don't think it makes sense for the Congress to be getting into the business of generating evidence. But harking back to a very important point that Bill made, I think it is important that we figure out a way to agree on what the evidence is. The Congress has sort of done this in the past with the Congressional Budget Office. The role of the Congressional Budget Office is to say what the budget impacts of legislation that has important budgetary impacts will be. And people can maybe disagree sometimes, but basically those are taken as what the facts are. This is what the impact of this legislation is going to be. And maybe there's some way that Congress could create an institution that's role was when important legislation comes up to summarize what the evidence is about what the effects of that legislation might be. And if we could agree on the facts, agree what high quality research shows and credible evidence is, maybe that would be a starting point for starting to address some of this partisan divide that Bill alluded to, which I agree is very troubling.
I'm going to take a slightly different tact. Given where I sit, I want to be really careful and not give Congress advice from OMB. That's not my job. But I was thinking about if I were giving anybody advice on doing something like this, and I am thinking about how one of the real strengths of our work, I think, was that we got to benefit from a lot of predecessor commissions, both those that were working on information, statistics, related topics, but also just those who helped us on process. Sorry, the mic was going out. Helped us on process for how do you stand up this entity and be effective and then shut it down in an orderly way. So I think we also spent a lot of time learning and hearing from people outside once we got going, and we really made that a priority. And we made time for it, and then we made time to shut the door and deliberate and have conversation and consider everything we heard. So if I were giving someone advice on trying to do something like this, I think it's just really important to learn from, because please don't reinvent the wheel of what we did, but learn from it, learn from other useful things, and take time to hear from people, and then give yourself time to figure out what it all means.
I would maybe add, find good leaders, people who can negotiate with their members. If you want unanimity, as Catherine and Ron prioritized, to negotiate their way to reach it. Find someone who can lead a good staff and recruit a good staff, and make that a priority. All right, we have a few minutes for questions. So I want to turn first, I'm tracking the questions that are coming in from online, but let me turn first to those in the room. Any questions for Ron and Shelley? Kathy, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, and I'll repeat it so the folks online can hear it.
Sure. So question mainly for Catherine, but Shelley may have ideas. So Catherine mentioned the federal-state partnership relationship, the fact that so much of the data for low-income population sits at the state level or below. So if you were going in to lead the National Secure Data Service with a blank slate, and one of your priorities was to be a service for state, local decision makers, giving them actionable insights that would link state data with federal data, like how would you do that? What would you do? How would you stand that up?
So the question is, if you were leading the National Secure Data Service and prioritizing partnerships between the federal and state governments, what would you do? I can summarize that succinctly. Good luck.
Thank you for that preface, because that was partly my reaction too. I think partly it's about sharing of resources. So one thing that the states will often say is, you, the federal government, are expecting us to do all of these things, and you're really not giving us the funding to do that. So that would be one thing that I would think about. I would think about whether there were ways to expand capacity at the state level. State governments often don't have data, people who are skilled at working with data. So I think all of that has to be addressed as part of this. So it's not exactly the National Secure Data Service, but in terms of the National Secure Data Service, the one thing that states often say is that they don't have any way to compare what's going on in their state to what's going on in other states. So I think that specifically is something that the National Secure Data Service could help with, is make it easier for them to find benchmarks.
I guess the one thing I'd add is, because we are having a lot of thoughtful conversations in the executive branch about, if we have this new entrant into the community, like what is it going to be? What is it going to do? So we've been thinking about these kinds of questions. And, one thing that I've been really impressed with is to learn more about how some of our current agencies, particularly statistical agencies, but in some cases program agencies, already have really deep and meaningful relationships with their state partners. We've got, I think the National Center for Health Statistics is probably the exemplar, but the Vital Records Program, where all of those partners get grants from NCHS, and all of those partners send their data to NCHS, and that's where all the health researchers go to have their data matched. I mean, in some ways, that's a model of some things, maybe not an ideal model in other respects. But we have different agencies who already have these relationships and kind of already know what's needed. And I think to Catherine's point, in some cases, it's, they've told us, the states want money to do this thing, whether it's modernization or standardization or whatever it may be. So in some cases, kind of back to the learning what's already been done, we do have some really good leaders in the federal and state government who have already told us kind of what their wish list is or what things are they think need to be done to make some of those partnerships work better. So I think, I would hope that the National Secure Data Service would not be competing with or duplicating some of those long-term, really positive programs, but really looking for gaps and places to kind of fill in where those relationships don't exist or something like that. So I just wanted to mention, again, many of these partnership models have come to the surface, and we're really hoping we can just mine those to see what is most effective and what is it we already know is needed.
A lot of room for collaborations. I think I saw a hand over here somewhere. Alex.
Sure, if I can ask loudly. No, it's fine. Part of the law said that OMB.
Sorry for the virtual audience.
Yeah.
Sure, Alex Howard. Part of the law said that in the Open Government Data Act, Title II, that OMB is supposed to issue guidance and then put out reports on how things were going. And neither one of these things has happened in the two administrations. We're going to talk about that in a second, but I'm wondering if you all could reflect upon what it means that hasn't happened, and what do you think is stopping it?
She just asked that. Like, a lot of people miss that. I would respectfully acknowledge that there are a number of requirements in the Evidence Act that we have not yet completed in the executive branch. My focus is Title III, but that's not to pass the buck. That's to say we've got some stuff due in Title III too that hasn't yet come out. So I obviously can't comment on deliberative internal stuff at OMB, but this is important stuff that needs to get done. We're working on it. And in the case of Title III, because the regulations, you guys get to see what we say in public through the government's unified agenda, because phase 2 is a guidance. It's not there. So on that one, we can't, I can't comment publicly on what is happening, but we are aware that we still have a lot to do to get the full act implemented.
We'll do one more question and then we'll move to the next group of speakers. From the online audience, there's a question actually about the data strategies that are coming out from individual agencies. So we have a macro strategy, the federal data strategy, but a number of agencies, education, labor, states have issued individual strategies. And I'm curious, obviously the Evidence Commission did not have a specific recommendation about data strategies of agencies. nonetheless, they're coming out. How does this fit in the kind of broader framework, do you think? Is it beneficial for agencies to have those? Does it fit in this lens of coordination, of governance? And the question is, do these further the evidence-based decision-making goals, and do they go far enough? Do you have any thoughts on this?
I think this is a better question for you, Shelley.
But of course, better for you. I'm just kidding. Personally, I think it's having written guidance from OMB over a number of years, guidance that's designed to affect the entire government is hard to write with like deep precision and nuance. I mean, there's a lot of diversity across federal agencies. And as soon as you have something that makes sense, someone says, well, what about the intelligence community? Or what about the Defense Department? And you realize, oh, it doesn't really fit in that, that's really hard. So to me, the federal data strategy, which is one of OMB's policies, is a very broad brush set of principles and practices. So agencies would need to kind of personalize it to make it meaningful for them. So to me, it makes perfect sense, just like we have individual agencies learning agendas. I mean, these are documents that you want the agency leadership to kind of own and personalize this broad set of guidance from OMB. So to me, it makes sense. Do they go far enough? I think you could probably ask that question about learning agendas too. And I think my colleagues who work on this stuff would say there's unevenness. And, we are working, especially with our councils, to sort of get everybody moving in the right direction. Some are starting from a strong starting point and others are just learning this stuff. So of course, they're probably going to be a little further behind.
All right, Catherine, Shelley, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to do a quick switch of the stage, but let's give them a round of applause. Next speakers up to the stage and introduce Corinna, who is Policy Director for the Data Foundation, who will introduce you to our next speakers.
Thank you, Nick, and then Alex Howard from the Digital Democracy Project, and Veronica Olazabal from the President of the American Evaluation Association join us. So thank you both for joining us, and we are tasked sort of with taking a different tack, thinking about what the Evidence Act and the Commission has meant for civil society, and thinking about sort of reflecting on my own experience with the Evidence Commission and what it has meant. I think it's very fitting because when I had first moved to DC, I was interviewing with an organization that supports the statistical system. And this was a new position that they were having, an advocacy position. And I asked the former director of the Census Bureau, well, what are you looking forward to in the next 5 years? What will I be working on? And he looked me dead in the eye and said, if this Evidence Act passed, that is what you will be working on. And so here I am, 5 years later, still working on the Evidence Act. And it's been a wild ride, and I've learned quite a bit. So, but there is a lot more to what the Evidence Act is besides the statistical system. Evaluators have had a significant role to play. Open data have had a significant role to play. So I'm going to ask you both to introduce yourself and kind of tell you from your particular seats what the Evidence Act and the Commission has meant for your community. So we'll just go down the line and start with Veronica.
Hello, everyone. Wow, it's loud. I'm Veronica Olazabal. I am president of the American Evaluation Association this year. I'm also Chief Impact and Evaluation Officer at some place called the VHP Foundation, which works in the philanthropic space. So when I think about the Evidence Act and when I think about data and evidence, I'm really thinking about it from both the supply and demand side. So I really liked that characterization earlier on. So I'm going to put on my AEA hat first and speak from the supply side. The American Evaluation Association is about 36 years old. It worked in partnership with the Data Foundation, as well as with Nick Hart and various other people to ensure that we kept beating the drum beats on the use of evaluation, on the use of evidence, on the use of data. As a sidebar, I really did like the point around the desilozation piece, because I do think that often when we think about data and then we think about evaluation, we somehow artificially bifurcate that. And so I see that both in the private sector side, I see that both in the philanthropic side, and I see that both in the government side. And so being able to bring these two communities together in a way that de-silos the conversation, I think, really meets the moment in terms of being able to act with urgency, to act in a quicker, probably more cost-effective way, theoretically. And so from an AEA perspective, that is something we've been working on. Really thinking about, number one, what does evidence look like in a post-pandemic type of space and place? And if we think about the Evidence Act 5 years ago, it was ahead of its time. It was thinking about these issues around capacity, around bringing different communities together, and around being able to establish the will. Because before you can have culture change, you really need to establish a precedence. Before you can start to build the skill base, you really need to have a pull. And before you can change systems, plumbing or the infrastructure, you really need some kind of basis. And so we've been working with our evaluation community to be able to build that capacity to work across different areas. This year's American Evaluation Association theme, for example, is focused on reshaping evaluation. And when we look at the Evidence Commission and then the Evidence Act and then where we are today, we're really seeing lots of disruptors that are bringing to the foresight the use of the need for a learning agenda and for learning officers, the need to understand what data responsibility, data privacy, data confidentiality looks like from an evaluation perspective, and the need to really think about community-based perspectives. What does bringing in lived experience look like? What does diversity look like? And so I do think that there's been a lot of wins. I think that there is some work to be done, as mentioned earlier, from the community civil society perspective that I think we'll talk about. But I will pass it on to you.
So the question is, what has it meant to the civil society side? Well, how has the last 5 years gone on the use of evidence in public policy from our federal government? How has it gone in our pandemic? And I should say, I come out of the data journalism world, come out of the open government advocacy world, come out of the side which asks for data in the original format, in a structured format, not scanned images sideways in a PDF. And the lived experience of people in the communities I come from is that things have changed. There are bright spots. There are application programming interfaces, APIs now. So if you want to make calls against something, you can get those things. There are bulk data downloads. There are individual people at agencies who are now willing to take questions about their data in the way they might not. But by and large, we are not seeing the kind of sea change that people like me, when I was working on the Open Government Data Act, and I was at the Sunlight Foundation, 2016, 17, and 18, it passed unanimously in the Senate before it was incorporated into the Evidence Act. What we hope to see. We hope to see what the law says, that open is the default. And open means open licensing, open formats, open without fees, open without proprietary entanglements put on top of that. And that's not something we can say we've seen across all of the agencies. If you talk to people who tried to work with, for example, data about epidemiology, about case counts, how many of us can say that that data is clean across the board, which is to say unencumbered by all of these things? It's not. Now, I would argue that the thing I asked about before is part of the problem. We haven't had the top of government pushing down and reminding the agencies of their obligations. We also haven't seen a harmonization of the Open Government Data Act, the Freedom of Information, which is, I think, a very important thing that I hope to see within this administration, which is put a bit more focus upon that. That's one of the things that I can say is a priority for me and part of my work. There are things to be, I think, happy about, and we've heard some of them. But in terms of the communities I come within, there's often a great deal of doubt. Oh, there's an Evidence-Based Policy Act. So you're saying that our appointees and politicians have to make decisions based on evidence? But what about this, this, and that? It hasn't circled down to something that is lived or believed in, because I don't think we're seeing the evidence being put into people's hands in a way that lets them contradict a matter of public policy. And until that rubber meets the road, I'm not sure we can say it's done what it's meant to.
Great. So it seems as though with Title II of the Evidence Act, the Open Government Data Act, it really sort of put these communities together, the statistical officials, the open data advocates, and the evaluation officers kind of all together. Do you find that to have been a helpful thing that was tied together? Does it adequately serve all of the needs of these stakeholders? And I'm going to turn it back to Alex and then maybe have Veronica weigh in.
I think that if the law were implemented as Congress intended, and if the agencies followed what the GIO told them to do in the end of 2020 and issued guidance and then followed up and drove hard on making sure that when data was released, it wasn't trapped in a PDF, it wasn't scanned. When FOIA requests were released, they weren't mailed as a CD with images, but were proactively disclosed in an agency website. If data.gov actually led to FOIA reading rooms and there was a back and forth between the 300 odd reading rooms, then you'd see widespread awareness within these communities. If you saw NGOs and academics and institutions really being able to work with that data and start to get insights out of it, instead of having to go buy it from other people who are cleaning it up and selling it. One of the dirtier secrets that agencies may not want to talk about is how many of them are buying back their own data after it has been cleaned up and restructured so they can get insights out of it. That's a waste of taxpayer dollars. Right? When we see those kinds of activities shifting and see the data flowing in ways that not only provides a subsidy to corporations that are buying it, but actually arms people with information about our country and what's happening in a way that enlightens us and empowers us to make decisions in our everyday lives, then we'll see some impact. And it's not to say this isn't happening, right? Weather data, GPS data, these are things people know about, but there's also the broad world of health data, something that is happening, the world of education data. These things are, I think, encouragingly moving in the right direction, but what's missing is the clear guidance from the top and then capacity to follow through on it. And that's one of the things I hope to see from this community and others.
I'm going to pick up on the capacity component to it. I think what Alex is speaking to, I've also been a direct user from. I worked for someone who actually did work for the Open Government. He was the chief technology officer under the Obama administration, and he raved about this particular piece. And when he came to work with us, I was working with the Rockefeller Foundation. I was thinking, okay, but how come I can't use any of this data? And so there's a lot of merit to what you're saying. On the flip side, if I connect it back to this new commission, this modernization commission, I think part of the piece for moving legacy systems is trying to move a lot of systems that have already been established. And so when putting on my philanthropy hat and working outside, whether it be private sector, whether it be philanthropy, whether it be impact investing and all the wonderful things that is not government, basically, it's easy for us to have solutions because we just start from the beginning. We can build from new systems and new platforms and modernize in that way. But the challenge is that you're trying to move and steer a huge ship one way or another, and that takes time. That takes change management, that takes cultural management. And I do think that bringing the people that know how to work with information, whether it be the statisticians, whether it be the evaluators or the data people together, so that they don't see themselves in a competitive way. Because that's the reality of it. We're all competing for market share, for visibility, for ability to influence. And if you force them to work together, I do think new solutions that will be right-sized for the system that you're working within will surface. And I do think that you working on that from a government perspective does allow us from working outside of government to start to think not just about how we're going to use the data, but what happens to all of the work that we're doing. The scaling solution for us is usually government will take that on. If government doesn't have data protection systems and policies already in place, you will get what happened in Afghanistan, where we were all basically in the development sector, moving people's personal data from Excel sheet to Excel sheet and it falling in the wrong hands. You have a higher accountability and a higher responsibility that some of us working outside of outside in the civil society space have, but we really do look to you to be able to have the infrastructure to be able to move quickly and at scale. And so from that perspective, I just think it's going to take a little bit more time and a lot more change management.
Those are some excellent points from both of you. And to sort of pick up on the metaphor of rebuilding the ship, a lot of the challenge with some of government is that they can't stop sailing it while they rebuild it. And that creates an awful lot of challenges about, continuing to publish data in a way that demographers, researchers, organizations like businesses require. And so things like the standard application portal that are being developed and out for register notice are meaningful improvements, and thinking about CIPC guidelines, Title III guidelines, thinking about how to harmonize those with broader privacy stakes. This is a very complicated ship to steer, and we can't put it in dry dock while we rebuild it. So it adds quite a bit of complications to it. So speaking about implementation, we've talked a little bit about sort of the challenges that we've seen, and we've talked a little bit about, but to be a little bit solutions oriented and not just to pick on government, what are maybe some of the suggestions you would have to help, or for OMB or other agencies to help prioritize implementation?
Alex.
So I know people in the country may not get excited about having chief data officers, but having somebody at the agencies whose job that is meaningful. One thing I would like to see, if we had OMB pushing on the agencies, is to say that the CIO and the CDO shouldn't be the same person. There are some agencies that have tried to do that. That's a bad idea. We should make sure that they actually honor the intent of Congress and have that person be there, be full-time, and be focused on being I hate to say it, a data general. Anyone who's worked with data knows that dirty data is a really big problem, and that cleaning it, structuring it, making sure it moves out is really important. One of the most interesting people I remember talking with in previous life was Mike Flowers back in New York City, because New York City behaves a lot like a huge federal agency in terms of its size, its budget, et cetera. And he hired a whole bunch of people, statisticians, quants, right, to go and systematically move through different data sets, clean them up, figure out what could be published, what couldn't in a data warehouse, and then move that online. And then to start to use that to empower their regulatory agencies to figure out which pharmacies are putting out the most illegal opioids, right? Which ones, which tenants were at most risk of fires. To start to look within the data to empower the people in government and to protect the people outside of government, then able to bring that back with an understandable improvement to people outside of government. And I think one of the things that I'd love to see more of is the CDOs being more public facing. So when people have questions about the data, there's a feedback loop between the people using the data and people not using the data. One of the things I love to see in government is think we're headed towards 1 million data sets in data.gov, but we're still in the hundreds of thousands. Each one of them should be, first of all, not a PDF, right? It should be open data. But second of all, should have someone who owns it. And if you have a question about that data, if it's not available, you can then go and find that person. And I guarantee that if each person owned a data set, if that was something we could all be connected to, then there'd be a human side to that, and we'd start to see the kind of virtuous feedback loops that people in this space have been hoping for a couple of decades now. Because this isn't brand new 5 years ago, this particular idea. And people who are tracking open government data sounds fancy, but it's really giving people information about government as envisioned by our founding fathers and the Enlightenment philosophers. A lot of them came up, right? The idea that this is ours and that we should have access to it, all be able to benefit from it equally, not just incumbents who can afford to get it. So some of the things I hope to see, and I think it's going to happen if enough of us all ask for it and keep demanding access in better formats.
So, the point I said earlier about a little bit of an artificial separation between data statisticians and evaluators. It's real. And so when you have a chief data officer, you are automatically relegating this work into a technical box. And I think part of the challenge with the world that we're living in right now, where there's trillions of data points that are created at a year, like in 2021, I have a stat that I'll share a little bit later, but That data is no longer a technical issue, it's a strategic issue. We talk about data currency now. So when we start to then think about evaluators have also been relegated to a technical box, something or a group of people that come together and judge the merit and worth of a particular investment, a particular pool of funds, allocations, legislation at a point in time that is artificially created. And in fact, the Evidence Commission makes it so that you have people like evaluation officers and learning officers earlier on in your pipeline, maybe to help bring their skill sets in order to equip and enable a system to be actually more strategic. And when you start to think about chief data officers and chief evaluation officers and you call them something different, you're creating confusion in the market. And so being a market actor that reacts to what government is signaling, I have firsthand experience of working with someone called a chief information officer, technology officer, and a chief data officer, and a chief evaluation officer. And they created this competition outside of the market. And so I think one solution would be to, I don't know why it keeps going in and out, but one solution, this is the punchline, the one solution would be to actually just call it one thing and figure out who reports to who and market lead in that regard. I would say lead with strategy and not technical expertise. So who is really important. The other piece to it, and just to build on your point around feedback, I think data people are trained in a particular way. And if you look at the demographics, most of the people that are being trained in a data-oriented skill do not look like the communities in which we're working. And so figuring out how to diversify that talent pool as you're bringing them in, as someone is waking up and one day this is their responsibility, whatever that is, figuring out a way to diversify this pool so that people that are working at an interface, whether through feedback, whether through making the case for communities, look like the people that you're talking about. That is the trend in the private sector. I would hope that that would also be a trend in the government sector, and that would be visible. Who are your visible champions? They certainly don't look like everybody in the room at the moment, but thinking about that. And then the other piece, perhaps this is going to be a technical solution. However, I think that the way that we've been trained to think about how change happens is, very linear, very step oriented. And I think we really need to figure out how to get from point A to point W much quicker. So perhaps it's, as Alex was mentioning, at least low hanging fruit, make sure your data is not in a PDF because that is very, very challenging. However, you need to be able to equip people to figure out how to analyze huge amounts of disparate pieces of information. And so making it a PDF is not going to help with that. There are capacity challenges there, but thinking about how you're going to use data solutions to actually leapfrog past these very stoic types of systems, I think is really about moving towards a government system, a data infrastructure that is the infrastructure of tomorrow versus believing that it's going to be a very linear, logical pathway to this new system that I think the Evidence Commission was envisioning 5 years ago. 5 years, by the way, is not a long time, and 3 of those years are a pandemic, so let's just put that out there.
An excellent reminder for all of us. Hearing you both kind of talk, it seems like it can't be understated how valuable leadership is in all of this. That when thinking about data as a strategic asset, knowing that there's a federal data strategy available, that we have leaders at every level bought in to doing these changes and making them a priority, and having people who are responsible and are able to report to seems like a very crucial part in helping this implementation move forward. I just want to remind everyone who's watching online, please feel free to submit questions, and we'll get to those in a little bit. We have a few more questions here. After the Evidence Commission, there was the Evidence Act, and now has been alluded to the National Secure Data Service Act, which are both very big bites at the apple. Thinking about your respective communities going forward, what are the big bites that you would like to see taken next?
So do you see data people? Do you see data people? I was thinking of this Sixth Sense when she said data people. You mentioned leadership. I think the reality is we have a huge, not just trust problem, but truth problem in our country right now. The RAND Corporation talked about truth decay, and I recommend that report to you. We have had, unfortunately, a phenomenon where facts have become unknowable to a lot of people. And even if you present open and structured data from trustworthy sources, it may still not be enough to bring them back into the fold of believing in it. And if you, I think, are coming from this evidence-based world, that's not the world you wanted to see 5 years on. You wanted to see a world in which we all have shared facts, ideally co-created ones, that are delivered by people who have an understanding of how they were created and some uncertainty about sort of the variability within them. The sorts of things that scientists are willing to talk about. A long time ago, I was trained as a biologist and sociologist, and there's always degrees of certainty of how noble something is. But the thing I would say, pulling things together, is not to pass another bill. It's to implement the ones that we've got and to think very carefully about how we can create trust in those facts. And it's not by heaping a program upon unelected bureaucrats or scientists or any of the rest of it, but actually to understand how the facts are created, what the evidence comes from, what it says and what it doesn't, and then be able to look at that together. And transparency in of itself isn't enough. There's got to be some level of responsiveness and participation. I think that is probably my big wish right now, is that our government of the people is willing to talk with the people. I talked about feedback loops. We are in a crisis situation when it comes to truth decay right now. If we have another pandemic, we are not ready to respond to it because people don't believe what the authorities say. They don't believe what the media say when they're reporting on the data. They don't believe what politicians are telling them. We need to have a different kind of dialogue with one another that incorporates all of the people who feel left out of it, talked down to, condescended to, and give them access to the raw materials of our democracy in a way that keeps those materials secure, talking about, say, electoral machinery here, but helps them feel trust that what they've been lied to isn't happening. And if we don't, I think, include that context within the Evidence Commission discussion, we're missing something really important. And my hope here is that we won't have national leaders who are willing to, frankly, use weapons of mass distraction, denial, deflection, to inundate people with doubt, right? With the sense that things aren't knowable anymore, because if that happens, what we heard about at the top from Mr. Hoagland does happen. Democracy itself goes away. And no matter how much data we put on data.gov, and no matter how much more responsive people are, it won't matter. I think that the need for us to revive a sense of trustworthiness in public service is important, and also, frankly, to celebrate civil servants more. It's a really important part of, I think, public discourse right now, where there is not enough defense of people in government who have been serving honorably, not just the last 3 years in the pandemic, but for many years before that. And if we don't see, I think, a sense that there is an ongoing crisis, then we're going to be caught not just flat-footed, but footless when the next one rolls in, whether it's a war, whether those UFOs turn out to be real, or whether it's the ongoing crisis from natural disasters that we can and should expect to be washing up on our shores and burning through our cities.
I have forgotten the question, but I'm going to build on what Alex just mentioned. So from a different perspective, and so, I believe that I can measure anything. I believe that you tell me that I need to find data, I will find data, and I will make an evidence-based decision or a recommendation to whoever the decision maker is. Because I don't believe that data looks or is homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous, and it's meaningful to whoever the decision maker is. So I'm of the belief, from the evaluation perspective, that regardless of what you do, regardless of what data you put forth, we will believe what we want to believe because human beings are cognitively biased in so many ways. And so right now we're living in a very politicized system because of this age of disinformation and misinformation on so many accounts: climate change, COVID, reproductive rights. We all see it all the time. And something that we've been talking about in the evaluation community is not about more data. That's just more money, and you're not going to move the needle because if someone believes in it's evolutionary rooted. We like to coalesce around people that look like us, think like us, in grouping and out grouping. So the sociologists know this very well. And so my thinking would be to suggest that you start to think about how you're going to reframe the issue. It seems very journalistic, actually, but we need Adam Grant and many good thinkers, organizational psychologists out there, think about, how are you going to break the cognitive biases that already exist around government, around how government works, around what evidence is generated, around what evidence is valid and not valid. So my suggestion isn't to, as you said, create more legislation because that's not going to solve the issue. It might not be internally or externally training more people, but do something that is completely out of the box. Perhaps launch a new program, a fellowship program, bringing different people together. Use data in a new and interesting way. And so when I start to think about this modernizing this new commission, I'm assuming it'll be a little bit of what is already existing. However, I think if the greatest minds that have been working on this commission, past and present and future, come together and think outside of the box, I am hopeful that in 5 years' time, when we're looking at the 10 years later viewpoints, we might be heading in a different direction that isn't the same type of situation that or the same processes and systems that we've been undertaking over the last 5 years.
Great. I think I can feel the collective sigh of government hearing from civil society. Please don't do anything new. Please just keep on doing what you're doing. Alex is disagreeing with that assessment. But that civil society is really looking forward to engaging with government on the mandates that they already have, on the programs they are already working towards, and that we are interested in getting those up and running before we need to yet again ask for a new ship to be built. So I'm going to turn to the audience to see if there are any questions for our panel before looking online. Oh, okay, let's start here and then we'll go to Sharon.
Should I use the microphone?
Oh, sure.
Or I can say loud.
Yes, say it. Go ahead, say it.
I'm Catherine. I'm with the Open Contracting Partnership, BHP Foundation funded.
Yes.
So it's great to have you here and have worked with Alex and the Data Foundation before. As I work on the Open Contracting Partnership, you will guess what my question is about. And it's about procurement data and how important procurement data are to evidence building. And one thing we advocate for is not just for more procurement data, but higher quality data, especially. So I was curious to hear from you, but also from the previous panelists, what you think the opportunity is for better, more procurement data and how they can contribute to, more trust building, more facts, better open government, and all of those things.
Great. So for the audience online, the question was about the value of procurement data for evidence building and what could be some of the strategies to more effectively use this for evidence building. Do we have?
I'll go first because I know exactly what we're talking about here. So just to give an example to ground why procurement is important, the BHP, which is the donor of the BHP Foundation, is amongst the largest energy providers, producers in the world. They own many of the copper and lithium mines that are out there. And part of the challenge is, so I'm going to talk about private sector and accountability and transparency. Part of the challenge with meeting the sustainability goals in the world is because on the private sector side, you don't have the same type of regulated system. It's very voluntary based. The challenge with a voluntary based system, of course, is that nobody knows what no one knows because no one is willing to share it because it's considered a bit of giving up your comparative advantage. The BHP company a few years ago basically committed to working towards a more sustainable, greener system, part of the just energy type of movement. However, they're inhibited from actually being able to share their own data at the procurement level, at the community-based level, because if they reveal their data, no one else will reveal their data. And so regardless of how good or how bad the information actually is, they will be critiqued and they will lose market share. However, if on the BHP Foundation side, which is an independent group from BHP, we are working on some of the enabling conditions and the enabling systems, the policies, for example, that requires companies to actually disclose their procurement data, then it levels out the playing field. And so this is a story not just about how do you build systems from within, but how do you think outside your box. If at the end of the day, you think about your why is it that you want to build this data system? Why do we want better evidence-based decision making? Because we're moving down a really bad sustainability path. And so if government is actually controlling some of those regulations that would unlock actually a bigger result or a bigger impact on the other side, then we would actually all be better off. And so when I said start thinking about outside the box types of solutions, that's an outside the box solution. It's like, how do you then develop and drive the enabling conditions that allows others to work in a more responsible kind of way? So that's that story. You can add on to that since you actually work on the project.
So no question about, I think, the fact that procurement, what government builds and buys, has been a vector for corruption in governments for centuries. And of course, wars are often the principal place where that goes through. And our government has taken some slices at trying to improve that. And I should have talked more about the benefits of USA spending. We should give some props for the Data Coalition, Data Foundation's work in taking the Data Act forward and implementing it well and modernizing USA spending. But I want to go back a little bit further to the Recovery Act and recovery.gov, which is offline now. But that was actually one of the first really big test cases for open data in the United States. Earl Devaney, RIP, speaking of public servants who really stepped up for our country, managed to dole out, I think, $787 billion and keep track of it all pretty well and keep corruption to a minimum. We are in the process of really starting to deal out almost $1 trillion in the infrastructure bill. And the bill that just was celebrated at the White House today, Inflation Reduction Act, has a whole bunch of money in it as well. There's money from the CHIPS Act. I mean, we have let the gates open. And we just came through one of the test cases for, I think, one of the worst runs, dole-outs of money in our country's history around PPP loans. And if you're tracking what the Department of Justice is saying, we have lost tremendous amounts of money through that. Unemployment fraud, huge amounts of money through that. Now, this is getting a little bit away from procurement, but it's still touched in the sense that there are things that we can do to improve that. Maybe at the top of the list is following through on something Congress kind of quietly did at the end of 2020. They banned anonymous shell companies in the United States. You might have missed that because there's a bit of other things going on. But in the NDAA, they put that through. Now, the database that came out of it is still private. Treasury is the one that owns it, and it is not public data like exists in the UK, where they have a beneficial ownership registry. It's a database of companies. What we're missing here in the United States is that same open by default registry, so that when it came to procurement, you could see which entity is getting money. And then maybe you can start to track that entity to how it's doing on spending it. And that's going to become quite relevant to us in the next couple of years as all of these federal dollars move into infrastructure. And if you look at American history, everybody knows that when the money gets spent on infrastructure, sometimes it disappears and projects don't go as well. We have a huge opportunity to rebuild trust with individual communities by showing them what's being done, who's doing it, and then when there is fraud, waste, or abuse, to actually follow through in feedback loops and reward people for blowing the whistle. Thank you, whistleblowers. You are back from the open government democracy. And showing people that actually reporting these issues comes back and benefits their community because the government cares about those things. And seeing that at the local level, I think, is one of the biggest opportunities we have, not least because our infrastructure does need work. So if we can connect, I think, the identifiers together with the outcomes, with the performance, and then show there's a feedback loop that's virtuous, there's a huge opportunity.
I'll just add, and so what Alex is speaking to from a different perspective is you need a powerful demonstration of the actual use. What would happen if all of the processes and systems landed and were working effectively? Because sadly, civil society doesn't really have patience for the nuts and bolts of what it takes to actually deliver. They just want some type of result and some type of outcome. But exactly your example is a really powerful demonstration of how when the stars align, regardless of what the limitations and the barriers are, what becomes possible that wasn't possible before.
Great, and Sharon.
Yes, hi, I'm Sharon Boyven. I'm one of the Deputy Chief Data Officers at the U.S. Department of Education. And we are very obviously committed to transparency and accountability as evidenced by the Education Stabilization Fund Transparency Portal and other activities. But I'm curious about your take on the role of intermediaries in helping the American public understand the value of data and the meaning of data. So what can civil society and what can the federal government do to support intermediaries that are trying to get the right message with the right data to the American people?
Great, so for the audience online, the question was, what is the role of intermediaries in helping civil society and government communicate the role and value of data?
Tell us.
So I really loved the COVID tracking project. That's something that you saw a consortium of journalists all around the country get together and collect data from all 50 states plus DC, Puerto Rico territories, structure it and publish it, and give us all shared facts about what's happening in our country as the pandemic went through. It's what the CDC should have done, but didn't for any number of reasons. I love the US.gov college scorecard, but I know that many college students have never been to USAD.gov and probably won't go. But many of them might go to college rankings from US News and World Report. The reality is that for most of us, as we've grown up, as I look in this audience, we've gone to huge media entities for information. So it's there that has 10, 100x. In 2022, of course, we have tech platforms as well. So the term maybe infomediary is a useful one. And in each case, I think it's useful for government to think about what audiences they want to reach, and then think about which intermediaries they need to kind of engage with, and then go to them and meet with them and see what data they are already using and improve how they're getting it. If they're already buying the data from government, then figure out, well, is there a way that we could do this better? If they're spending huge amounts of money having to improve it, all right, thank you. You know, you're making money from this. One of my favorite examples in this space is inspection data of all things. When our government goes and looks at nursing homes and dialysis centers, they inspect them and see if they're any good or not. Do people go to hospitalcompare.gov? Do people go to look at Medicare sites? Not so much. They go to Yelp. So when the data was structured and then ProPublica did the hard work of getting through it, they made a partnership with Yelp, go to Yelp and see the scores. I think in each case, what we should be thinking about is how to help data find the people, not make people find it. So US Ed has all this wonderful data, figure out where are college students or prospective college students looking and help them find it there. I love librarians, right? This is a natural community to be engaging with. How could you go to your local library and figure out how to match up? But that's not the only place. The tech companies have taken a lot of justified heat. I would be looking at them to say, hey, you could show your civic virtue by pulling in this data and then enabling people to make better decisions with it that isn't just to commercial benefit, but to civic benefit. And things like the Voting Info Project show how that could go, right? Sort of the info centers they put up. But there's a lot more that could be done. What I hope is that more people in your position, people outside of government, will be given opportunities through ongoing relationships and roundtables to improve this. One of the best examples of that is actually the Congressional Data Coalition and the Bulk Data Task Force, not just the Data Task Force in Congress. Do you all know that Congress.gov has an API now? Just happened. It's been there for a while, but they haven't exposed it. All of the work that they do is ongoing online and then happens through a quarterly meeting from civil society and the agency, in this case, Ledge Branch. There's no reason every federal agency couldn't be doing the same thing. And figuring out who their data consumers are and who their data downloaders are and hosters are, and start to think about those loops. And the more that happens, the more opportunity I think we'll see to our investments and for people like you who are stewards to actually get more in return.
So when I think about your question, I think about an analog of when I worked at the Rockefeller Foundation and we coined the term impact investing. Part of the challenge with, whenever you coin a new space, like resilience, just put the word out there, there's no infrastructure there's no infrastructure that actually is there to respond. What if I hold it like this? What if I hold it like this? Like this? To respond to, is this good? Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. To respond to, there we go. To respond to the new demands. And I think part of the, so that's one thing. The second thing is, when I look at the role of philanthropy, oftentimes we're talking about using our risk capital to work in areas that government is not working. But eventually, we would hope that government would absorb some of these areas. So when I look at the data infrastructure right now, I think it's primarily driven by private sector. It's primarily driven by philanthropic dollars and dollars that are outside of government. You don't really relate government to data and tech and innovation and things of that nature. And so I do think that though we are at a mature level now, and I think that a good demonstration of what the space needs is the build out of that infrastructure. How can you, government, enable civil society associations? So let's just talk about the Data Visualization Society, for example, or the American Evaluation Association, which I'm representing today. We are nonprofits that are working to build that capacity, that infrastructure, but we always are limited in resources. We're always limited in people. It's primarily based on volunteer hours. Hours that many of us are stretched and we can't be at all places at all times. So if government were really serious about equipping the plumbing, equipping the infrastructure, I do think we'd see a visible commitment to that infrastructure building that I'm not seeing at the moment. And so that's just one suggestion.
All right, wonderful. So we are going to wrap up this panel. Thank you both so much for your thoughts, and really looking forward to having you back in 5 years to talk about this again.
All right, Veronica, Alex, Verona, thank you so much. To close us out, I want to invite our final speaker of today to offer some brief closing remarks. And that final speaker is Kim Wallen. Kim is a former member of the Evidence Commission, also a former controller in the state of Nevada. She was an appointee from Senator Harry Reid to the commission. I got that right. Okay, Kim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to be back and seeing some of my old friends. When I was asked to go on to the commission, I was really, really excited because evidence-based policymaking. Because right before I started being controller, I attended an interim finance committee meeting at the legislature. And there was an agency that came before the legislature and they were asking for more money for one of their programs. And I think it was for stopping underage smoking or something like that, or might have been DARE. And one of the legislators said, "What have your results been?" They go, "I don't know. You'd have to ask the contractor." And I was just like mortified. And the legislature gave them money. So this policymaking commission is like, this is right up my alley because I think we need to do more and more of it. Getting on the commission, I was the only person on the commission that was from the state. Everybody else was a researcher, lots of economists. I was a lowly accountant in the group. But it was okay. Someone said that they'd had been around a lot of attorneys before and they were the only economists. So I guess it's only fair. But it was a really, really good group. And this group, some of the things we found were all the different silos where you can't access education data that goes to a private company. The government doesn't have access, and it just, the list went on and on and on. And we probably came up with over 200 recommendations, and we had to narrow them down. And we did, all right? But one of the things that happened when we narrowed them down, and I really think that it was, how we did it was the right way. It was truly a framework. We weren't prescriptive saying, do this, this, and this. And I think because of that, that's why we've had legislation passed and we've moved on, and this report hasn't sat on the shelf collecting dust. We've actually gotten to see some accomplishments. But some of the things that I would like to see going forward that we didn't accomplish in there was a lot of the recommendations are at the federal level. Pretty much all of them are at the federal level. So going forward, I think we really need to look at how do we bring the states and local governments in. We're talking about the National Secure Data Service database. And I think that's something that we really have to make an effort as we start to roll it out, even in the pilot part of it. How can we involve state and local governments, giving us their information, sharing our information with them, because I think it would make make better policymaking decisions within the state legislators, because it all rolls up. We're all part of it, right? So that's one of the things that I would like to see us do, is definitely involve the states and help the states to use evidence for policymaking decisions. Because I think a lot of times the legislators, it's just, well, I like you, so I'm going to do this policy for you because you've got my ear. Instead of, let's take the lobbyists out of making the policy making. That's very important. And if we use the data and evidence, we can do that. And another thing that I would like to see us do, and we didn't really get to it, and it was part of the commission's broad brush of everything we had to do, was the cost benefit analysis of programs. And, we can have all this evidence, but if we really don't understand the cost benefit of it, and we just look at one side of it, say you give money out for housing, well, that's going to help keep kids in school. So that helps educate the population. It's going to help people stay employed. But a lot of times when you do cost benefit analysis, you just look at one side of it. So I think we really need to also address that issue as well. Let's see what comments, my ahas as I'm sitting here. The other thing, Alex, you're talking about data and getting data that's not in PDFs and Veronica and stuff. One of the things we need to look at is this data in the data service thing should be tagged, should be metadata, maybe use XBRL, all right? So that way you can take the data and use it and put it into a form that everybody can read and understand, right? I think that's another thing that's very important to do. And we have to give states the resources, help them with the modeling and stuff with it as well. And like Catherine said, yes, funding is a huge issue, and that's something that we need to do as we go forward. And then let's see what else. Okay, we're talking about scaling up, but those are some of the things that I see for the future. And it was very interesting listening to Alex and Veronica's comments and stuff. I love data, but we have to always put data in the context. When I was controller, I had somebody call me up, or they went to the press and they said, Nevada is upside down in their pension fund. I forget how many millions of dollars, but what they left out was our pension fund funds 183 employees in the state. It wasn't just the state of Nevada having that liability. So it's data in context. We have to be very careful of it. And I think that's about it, but I'm really excited about the work of the commission and everybody's putting forth all this great effort and continuing on. And I'm glad it's still alive and well, and it hasn't just been one more thing that we thought about and went down the tube. So thank you very much.
I don't know that I can say that any better. Well, let me just conclude today by saying thank you everyone who joined us in person. Thank you to everyone who joined online. So the Data Foundation is releasing this progress report today that highlights all 22 of the recommendations, as well as what's happened with congressional action and the executive branch action. You can find it on our website, datafoundation.org. If you're in person, we have hard copies. It culminates with a set of recommendations for the evidence and data community. And actually, you've heard the speakers basically highlight all of those recommendations. So I'm not going to really go super in depth here. One of them is to take the recommendations that come out of what's the forthcoming report of the Advisory Committee on Data for Evidence Building. You'll see this on October 21st. It's forthcoming. There will be recommendations. It's going to be a very long report, so hang in there. But it's going to go public on October 21st to the OMB director. We've also had a fairly extensive set of comments about resources. We can't do this work without resources. That is funding, that is people. Both are critical for agencies to get this work done. And it's not just about the federal government. There's huge implications here for states, local governments, and tribes. You've heard some comments about the need for guidance and regulations that are pending out of the Evidence Act. And of course, those are huge priorities. And then finally, facilitating dialogue and building procedures within agencies to really think about some of the recommendations where we have not yet seen action. Catherine addressed this in the first section of this event. There are, of course, recommendations that have not been acted upon. Some of these do require legislation. And of course, we do need to continue the conversation about tax data and some of the important data sharing capabilities that are forthcoming to figure out how to continue that progress. So as we continue all of this work, of course, there's much left to do, but we can also recognize the incredible accomplishments, many in this room, those who have tuned in online, those who could not join us, the commissioners, the staff, those who are working in agencies to implement the Evidence Act. There are a lot of people to really applaud in this story. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to the Bipartisan Policy Center for partnering with us on today's event. And for those that are joining us in person, we invite you to join us in the reception. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you soon.